Welcome to Warriors of the World. Imagine yourself standing in a dense forest, surrounded by a light mist hanging in the air. There's a silence that feels eternal, but in the distance, drums beat like the pulse of an ancient heart. Slowly, you start to hear footsteps growing closer, and among the trees, an imposing figure appears. Face painted, hair braided, eyes intense. This is a Celtic warrior, and you're about to step into the world of these fierce people who boldly defied empires and left their mark through time. The Celts lived in lands now called France, Spain, Ireland, and even parts of Turkey. They were a varied people united by a warrior culture. While other civilizations valued strict military order, the Celts had their own approach. Each warrior was unique, and their battles were expressions of personality. Imagine soldiers who were not just fighters, but also poets, musicians, farmers. For the Celts, war was more than duty. It was a celebration of life and death. And the Celts stood out beyond the battlefield. Their traditions, passed down through generations, told of legendary heroes, fickle gods, and mystical beings. Celtic faith wove the real world with the supernatural. In every tree, stream, and hill, they saw a spirit, a sacred force linking them to ancestors. This bond with the divine made them fearless. For them, to die in battle was to join the ancient heroes and be honored forever in the halls of the gods. With their decorated weapons and armor adorned with feathers and bones, Celtic warriors did not enter battle just to win, they came to make an impression. Imagine the psychological impact of a line of Celtic warriors approaching, tattoos and painted faces, war cries shaking even the most seasoned enemies. In this video, we'll explore who these warriors were. From legends to historical facts, from unusual tactics to the great leaders who inspired resistance against the world's greatest empire. Get ready for a journey that will reveal the Celtic spirit in all its fury, glory, and bravery. Now that you've glimpsed the Celtic spirit, let's look into the world these warriors inhabited. Forget cities with stone walls or armies in disciplined ranks. The Celtic universe was very different from the empires of Rome or Greece. Rather than a centralized empire, the Celts lived in autonomous tribes spread across vast regions of Europe, from Gaul to the British Isles and the Iberian Peninsula. Each Celtic tribe was like a small kingdom. There was a chief or king, often the most respected warrior, who led with honor and courage. Celtic society was deeply hierarchical, yet had a more democratic side compared to others of their time. Key decisions were made in assemblies, with druids, sacred figures who served as priests, counselors, and wisdom keepers, playing an essential role. Druids weren't just spiritual guides but also political advisors and even mediators in tribal disputes. Their words carried such weight that even kings would bow before them. But it wasn't all brute strength and inter-tribal battles. In Celtic society, men and women held important roles. Women could fight, rule, and held rights that, for the time, were revolutionary. Some became legends, like Queen Boudica, who rose against the Roman Empire. Among the Celts, bravery and skill mattered more than gender. Thus, warriors walked side by side, all driven by the same belief, that honor and a fighting spirit were above all. The Celts were so deeply connected to nature that they viewed the earth itself as sacred. The forest was their stronghold, rivers marked their territories, and mountains and hills were sites of rituals where they sought the gods' protection before each battle. Every step they took, every act of life, reflected this deep connection with the world around them. They could be fierce in combat, yet they had a unique ability to celebrate life. Festivals marked the changing seasons, with music, dances, storytelling, and challenges of bravery. Nights were lit by bonfires and filled with laughter, while bards sang of ancient heroes and past wars. To the Celts, living and fighting were parts of the same journey, a journey we'll take together, exploring every detail of this captivating world. Now it's time to dive into what made Celtic warriors so impressive and feared, their weapons and fighting style. The Celts were no ordinary soldiers. Each warrior carried their weapons as extensions of their spirit. They prepared for battle with a ritual, and their swords, spears, and shields were crafted with such care that they often bore carved symbols, gold and silver details, and even mystical runes for protection. Each piece of armor reflected its owner's pride, skill, and beliefs. Imagine the psychological effect of a horde of Celtic warriors approaching. They wielded long curved swords called Celtic blades, which, in their hands, became tools of destruction and spectacle. These swords were famous for their slightly curved shape, designed not only to pierce but to make wide, brutal cuts. Rather than full armor, many Celts chose to protect only the essentials, and in some cases, fought bare-chested, displaying courage or perhaps disdain for death itself. But if you think they were just brutish fighters, you'd be wrong. The Celts used oval shields made of reinforced wood, adorned with medals and paintings that made warriors look even more intimidating. The shields weren't just for protection. They had a visual impact and were actively used to strike and unbalance opponents. Their spears, meanwhile, varied from long ones for throwing to shorter ones for close combat, often decorated with feathers, stones, and tribal symbols that brought the warrior luck and intimidation. And have you heard of the carnix? This was a Celtic war trumpet, made of bronze and shaped like an animal's head, often a boar, symbolizing strength and ferocity. The carnix's sound was so terrifying that its sole purpose was to shake the enemy mentally. Imagine a battle where, along with visual and physical impact, the ominous sound of this instrument echoed through the forest. It was as if the Celtic gods themselves were roaring alongside their warriors. The Celts' fighting style was fierce and intense, with little formal organization but an unmatched aggressiveness and passion. To them, entering combat was a moment of glory, a wild dance between life and death. This mix of personalized weapons, brutal techniques, and unbreakable spirit created a force few could face without hesitation. The Celts didn't just live for battle. They lived for stories. Some of the most legendary and inspiring Celtic figures were heroes who defied armies, faced monsters, and even challenged the gods. Let's explore some of the most remarkable Celtic warriors, whose legends have echoed through the ages, becoming true myths. We start with Cuchulainn, the greatest hero in Celtic stories, whose name thundered across the lands of Ireland. It's said he had extraordinary strength and incredible speed, earning him the name Hound of Cuillin. In one of his most famous feats, still very young, Cuchulainn defended the kingdom of Ulster alone against an entire army. Armed with a magical spear called the Gibulg, he defeated everyone who dared to cross his path. But what made Cuchulainn even more fascinating was the Riostrad, a kind of divine rage that took over him in battle, distorting his body and making him nearly invincible. Accounts say that, in this state, even his allies feared to approach him. Another legendary name is Vercingetorix, a true military leader who not only united the Celtic tribes of Gaul but directly challenged the era's greatest military power, the Roman Empire. Young and ambitious, Vercingetorix led an uprising that gathered dozens of tribes in a collective effort to resist Roman domination. He was a natural strategist, using guerrilla tactics and knowing every bit of his land to ambush Julius Caesar's army. Unfortunately, his story ended in defeat at the Battle of Alesia, where, surrounded and without resources, Vercingetorix fought to the last before surrendering, becoming an eternal symbol of Celtic resistance and pride. There were also the warrior women, like Scathack, a powerful warrior and weapons master in Irish mythology. She's known for training great heroes, including Cuchulainn himself. Living in the mysterious land of shadows, Scathack is described as invincible and an expert in all forms of combat. Besides being an uncompromising instructor, she was a living legend, and her figure inspired Celtic women to be as respected and feared as men. These heroes weren't just warriors. They were living legends embodying Celtic courage, honor, and resilience. Their stories were told around fires, passed from generation to generation, and used to inspire new warriors. In knowing these figures, we see that for the Celts, battle was more than a physical fight. It was a spiritual challenge, a way to etch their names into eternity. Now it's time to understand how the Celtic warriors faced their enemies. Though the Romans saw them as disorganized barbarians, the Celts had a unique style of combat and ingenious strategies that often caught the enemy by surprise and left them terrified. The Celts didn't fight in organized lines like the Romans. Instead, they relied on fast attacks, using their knowledge of the land and the element of surprise. Ambushes were one of their main strategies, and each tribe knew the paths and forests surrounding their territories well. In one of these ambushes, they attacked from various directions, suddenly appearing and disappearing as quickly as they came. The goal was to confuse the enemy, and before they could react, the Celtic warriors would have already vanished into the forest. Celtic war chariots were also one of their secret weapons on the battlefield. These wooden vehicles, equipped with blades on the wheels, were handled with expertise. They tore through enemy lines at high speeds, opening gaps and causing panic. Amid the chaos, warriors would leap from the chariots straight into the heart of battle, wielding their swords and spears with ferocity. This mobility and boldness were signature traits of Celtic warfare, which combined brutality with choreography-like precision. Another frightening aspect was the Celtic war cry. Before battle, they would stand on the front lines and release deafening cries that echoed through the hills and forests. This tradition wasn't just a symbol of courage, it was a psychological tactic. Imagine being a Roman soldier, used to military rigor and silence, and suddenly hearing a wall of guttural voices from the darkness. These terrifying sounds were joined by the carnix, the Celtic war trumpet, roaring like an enraged beast. This display could shake any enemy's morale before the first strike. Celtic warriors were also unpredictable. During combat, they moved freely and wildly, with no obvious patterns. For opponents, facing a Celt meant trying to predict the unexpected, making even the most seasoned soldiers struggle. This blend of aggressive tactics, psychological strategy, and mastery of terrain made the Celts formidable opponents, reminding us that an army doesn't need conventional order to be devastatingly effective. Let's take a look at how these warriors lived outside the battlefield. It's easy to imagine the Celts always with swords in hand and war cries, but their daily lives were much richer and even surprising. To start, Celtic warriors had a unique look that went beyond armor. Tattoos were common, and many Celts decorated their bodies with tribal symbols and animal figures. Their skin was a canvas, expressing identity and their bond with gods and nature. They used a dye called woad, extracted from a local plant, which gave the skin a bluish tint and helped create the near-mythical image of warriors covered in designs and symbols. The Celts also took great pride in their hair. They used a type of primitive gel, made from lemon and ashes, to spike their hair or even form intricate braids. If you think only Vikings used iconic hairstyles, the Celts were there much earlier, styling their hair and beards in ways that commanded respect. Another curious aspect of Celtic life was the bond between warriors. In some tribes, they formed a kind of brotherhood or oath-bound alliance of life and death. This bond wasn't just about loyalty. For them, it was sacred. Among warriors, there was an absolute trust, and in peacetime, they trained together, shared knowledge, and even composed songs and poetry. Believe it or not, these fierce warriors had an artistic and poetic side. Music, songs, and poems were highly valued, and Celtic nights were often filled with feasts, mead, and long sessions of storytelling and music around bonfires. Speaking of mead, this drink was an important part of Celtic culture, especially in celebrations. At great feasts, the Celts celebrated victories, honored the dead, and, of course, fostered a sense of unity. On these occasions, everyone was equal. Warriors, peasants, leaders, and bards shared laughs, toasts, and even contests of strength or courage. These details show a side of the Celts often hidden behind the warrior image. They took pride in their traditions and led lives full of celebration, artistic expression, and bonds of friendship. The Celtic warrior was much more than a fighter. He was a complex individual, tied to his people, his beliefs, and his way of life, a true defender of a unique and fascinating culture. To understand Celtic culture's depth, we need to know the Druids, the most enigmatic and respected figures among the Celts. Druids weren't only religious leaders. They acted as counselors to chiefs, healers, and even mentors to young warriors. Imagine growing up in a society where your spiritual guidance and even combat strategies came from figures so wise and powerful. Druids believed that every part of nature held a spirit, and this spiritual connection was a strength they instilled in warriors. Before a battle, it wasn't uncommon for a Druid to perform protection rituals, consecrating the warrior's weapons and armor. They conducted ceremonies in forests and mountains, sacred places believed to be the homes of the gods. These rituals served to shield the warriors in combat and ensured they fought with honor, respecting both life and death. Druids were also keepers of Celtic knowledge. Since their culture was mainly oral, they were responsible for passing down teachings and myths that strengthened Celtic identity. For this reason, warriors saw themselves not only as soldiers but as protectors of an entire cultural legacy. This spiritual bond with their ancestors and gods gave the Celts a bravery that few enemies could understand. While the Druids were peaceful, they had a direct influence over matters of war. In many tribes, the chieftain made final decisions only after consulting the Druids, who used ritualistic methods to predict battle outcomes. Druids were seen as fate-bearers, voices of the gods' will. This union of faith, strategy, and tradition made the Celtic warriors a formidable group, hard to defeat, reinforcing the strength of a culture that challenged the passage of time. The Celtic warriors were fierce and independent, but over the centuries, their tribes came into contact with other cultures, forming alliances and often facing enemies that tested their limits. Among their greatest adversaries was the Roman Empire, with its disciplined army and advanced technology, bringing challenges the Celts had never seen before. The wars against Rome began with sporadic skirmishes but grew intense over time. The most famous Celtic attack on Rome took place in 390 BC, when the Celts invaded the city itself. Led by a legendary chief named Brennus, the Celtic warriors advanced with such determination that, upon reaching the gates of Rome, they shouted the iconic phrase, "Vi victis!" Woe to the vanquished! This attack was a deep blow to Roman pride, pushing them to modernize their tactics and strengthen their defenses. Despite the fierce confrontations, the Celts also established alliances and cultural exchanges with other civilizations. In the northern Iberian Peninsula, for instance, they formed bonds with Iberian peoples, sharing traditions and combat strategies. These exchanges enriched Celtic practices and weaponry, adapting them to a more versatile style of warfare. Some Celtic tribes even adopted cultural elements from other peoples. In Galatia, in present-day Turkey, a Celtic population settled and thrived, blending with Greeks and influencing the local culture. This unique exchange showed that, despite their reputation for aggression and independence, the Celts had a remarkable capacity for adaptation. These interactions with the world around them shaped the Celts' path, leaving a legacy that extended beyond battles. For them, every conflict, alliance, and cultural exchange was a way to honor and strengthen their identity, always keeping the flame of resistance alive. Today, centuries after their disappearance, Celtic warriors still captivate the modern world. They appear in movies, books, series, video games, and even comic books, always represented as brave warriors, connected with nature and wrapped in mystical rituals. This image reflects the strength of Celtic culture, which remains alive in cultural depictions through time. In films, one of the most memorable portrayals of the Celts is the figure of Queen Boudica, who appears in historical productions challenging the Roman Empire. Boudica's legend is idealized as a symbol of female resistance and tribal power, showing how the Celts valued courage and leadership among their warrior women. TV series have also explored the Celtic mystique, like Vikings, which brings references to Celtic culture, especially in its connection with nature and spiritual views on death and battle. Video games have also been an important channel for Celtic culture. Games like Total War, Rome 2 and Assassin's Creed Valhalla let players explore the Celtic lifestyle, battles, and rituals. These games not only popularize their tactics, weapons, and spirituality but also revive interest in them. Another example is the RPG The Witcher, where we see various elements of Celtic mythology and culture reflected in the characters and creatures inhabiting the game's fantasy world. And, of course, literature is full of Celtic influences. Celtic mythology even inspired the world of Harry Potter, where Professor Dumbledore, for instance, is named with a Celtic word meaning wise leader. The Celts' lifestyle and legacy still echo in fiction, keeping their memory alive in each reference. Pop culture has transformed the Celts into a symbol of freedom and mystery, bringing their stories and traditions to a new generation. In this way, the Celtic world remains as fascinating and vivid as when these warriors inhabited the forests and fields of ancient Europe, allowing us to connect with their unique and indomitable energy. The Celtic warriors may have disappeared from the forests and fields of Europe, but their spirit lives on wherever courage and resilience are celebrated. They challenged empires, followed their own laws, and honored nature and the gods in a unique way. The Celtic legacy reaches far beyond battles. It lives in music, legends, symbols, and, above all, in the idea of freedom. Even today, we see traces of the Celts in small ways. From the fascination with tribal tattoos to the respect for connecting with nature and valuing cultural identity. In a world searching for roots, it's easy to understand why the Celts remain so captivating. Their stories remind us to live with passion, defend our beliefs, and honor traditions, no matter how challenging. But, looking back, it's impossible to ignore their duality. Were the Celts heroes or simply enemies of progress who tried to resist change? The answer depends on how we view the struggle between preserving a culture and the unstoppable force of empires that changed the world. And this complexity is what makes the Celtic Warriors so intriguing. At the end of this journey, it's clear these warriors were not simply barbarians, but people fighting to live by their values. In a way, the Celts' bravery and indomitable spirit continue to inspire generations who also want to challenge convention and seek their own paths. May they be remembered not only for the battles they fought, but for the fire they never let die. If you enjoyed this journey through the world of the Celts, subscribe to our channel and join Warriors of the World as a member so you won't miss upcoming stories about history's most legendary warriors. Soon, more epic tales of brave fighters from the past await you.